Well, hello, good evening, everybody. We've got about 82 people here so far, and I think it's starting to stabilise, so I shall make a start. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome everybody this evening. It's really exciting to see so many people interested in the topic of conservation grazing, and we really hope it's an indicator of the increased interest in nature-friendly practices. This is the second in the third of a mini-series about conservation grazing, which is brought to you in collaboration with PONT. My name is Cass Crocker. I'm a Plant Life Project Officer working on the Magnificent Meadows Wales project, and I'll be chairing today's session. So just a few words about Plant Life. We are a conservation charity dedicated to the conservation of wildflowers, plants and fungi. And if you want to find out details about our current campaigns, our citizen science projects and other great things happening in Plant Life, then do check out our website. Magnificent Meadows Wales is a Welsh Government funded project in partnership with National Trust and the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare. It's a 3-year project. It started in the summer of 2019 and aims to increase the extent as well as the interest and engagement in our flower-rich grasslands and meadows. We work both on large-scale restoration projects with the National Trust and also with smaller creation meadow projects in urban settings where we work with local communities, schools and hospitals. We are absolutely thrilled to be collaborating with PONT for this series. PONT work across Wales with farmers, conservationists, community groups and individuals. They come with practical grazing solutions that will benefit all animals, nature and people. They do this by offering a range of professional advisory, educational and community engagement services, as well as supporting other projects, developments and delivery by bringing their grazing expertise. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Emma from PONT, Emma Douglas, and she'll introduce this evening's session. The topic is, as you know, conservation grazing on grassland. It's part 2, and this evening is about choosing your livestock. Emma is PONT's development officer and facilitates grazing and associated management across South West Wales, and I think is eager to start. I think she thinks I was handing over there. Sorry, Emma. She works with a large range of audiences and is skilled in bringing together, resolving issues and seeking grazing solutions on rural and urban sites. Emma grew up on the Caeau Peninsula and she continues to assist the running of a small herd of cattle and horses at the family farm. And she also runs her successful business, Gower Meadows Beef. And I think it might be called Living the Dream. I think it sounds very good. Emma will be supported by 3 brilliant guest speakers this evening. We've got Owen Griffiths, Jane Bisset and Amanda Evans. And I'll leave it to Emma to introduce them. I believe Jane and Amanda might be attending by video, a recording. So for those of you who haven't used Zoom before, I expect you're all starting to get familiar with it, but you've automatically been muted because it's a webinar. So you can see and hear us, we can't hear or see you, but please do use the chat and the Q&A features. They're there for you to communicate with us. And we'll be feeding links in through the chat as we go along. We'll have a 30-minute Q&A session at the end, so please do use that to pose your questions. The Q&A bar is really helpful for us to manage the questions, so if you could use that rather than the chat if you want us to pose a question directly to the guests. I think that's it from me, so let's get started and listen to our brilliant selection of exciting speakers. Over to you, Emma.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Thanks, Cass, for the lovely introduction. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you about choosing your livestock for conservation grazing on grassland. So I'll give a little introduction, and then we'll hear from Owen Griffiths, who is from Elasted in West Wales. He conservation grazes his Section A ponies on 2 sites in West Wales, which he'll take you through. Then we'll hear from Amanda Evans via video. She runs the Caeau Mynydd Mawr project in Crosshands, which is a landscape scale project focusing on habitat for the Marsh Fritillary butterfly. And we'll also hear from Jane Bisset of Kennixton Sheep. She breeds native primitive breed sheep, and she's been taking part in conservation grazing, particularly at Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, where she's been part of the successful grazing project there to create habitat for the for lapwing. It's been a very successful project, and increased the amount of breeding lapwing on that island year on year. So that's great news. So we've got a video from a couple of years ago and an updated video as well to show you. And then we'll have PONT's North Wales officer who will join us on the panel later on, so you can ask her any questions you like about conservation grazing. She's the guru, and she's got a farm business, and she also takes part in conservation grazing with cattle and sheep and goats and ponies as well. So I will start. So choosing your species of livestock. So ponies are native to the UK. Here you see a cave painting which depicts a tarpan, which is the ancestor of our native ponies. And the Caeau ponies here, which you see on the other side of the screen, they derive from the Celtic pony, which is an ancestor of and tarpan are their ancestor. And Owen will take us through the history of the Welsh Section A, which are an improved breed of Caeau ponies. So these survived the cull by Henry VIII by hiding in the Caeau ponies, Caeau mountains. Cattle. So cattle are descendants of the Oroxen. So they're a native part of our ecosystem. And you can see that here they're depicted in cave paintings. Our domestic breeds are derived from domesticated Oroxen, and we used to have breeds which are perfectly adapted to each area of Wales, and those are the ancestors of our Welsh black cattle, our ancient cattle of Wales, and our Dyma'r white part cattle, which we find in Dyma'r. We've also got sheep. So sheep aren't actually a native part of the fauna of Britain, but they've been here since the Bronze Age, and they came over in a few different influxes. So originally in the Bronze Age they were domesticated in the Middle East, and they were brought the Mediterranean. They were brought across during the Bronze Age and used for meat and fibre and milk. So these soways here, they've derived from that influx of sheep. Then we had the Vikings brought over sheep, so like the Herdwicks and the Scottish Blackface. So that's where their origins lie, and the Romans and in later introductions of the white sheep. So they're also the basis of our modern breeds. And again, Wales would have had its native. It would have had breeds which were perfectly adapted to the weather conditions, the diseases, the forage availability of each area of Wales, which we still have today. And we have goats, again, they were domesticated in the Mediterranean, not actually a native part of our fauna, but they can kind of take the place of deer browsing, because they focus on browsing. So they were brought over in the Bronze Age as well, and again used for fibre and skin and milk. So how animals graze. So here are some goats. They are expert browsers. So they like to take high quality forage in the form of leaves and shoots. So they focus on browse. They don't tend to take grass as much or herbs, but they really are browsing specialists. They've got incisors on the bottom and a dental pad at the top of their mouth, very nimble lips. So they're perfectly suited to browsing. Here you've got cattle. So cattle, again, they're ruminants, as are goats, and they haven't got mobile lips like goats have. They've got a very wide muzzle, which makes them a very non-selective grazer. They use their tongue to wrap around the vegetation, and then they take it into their mouths. And then again, they've got this pad at the top, teeth at the bottom, and molars at the back for grinding, which starts the digestion process. And they can take very high cellulose or high silica fodder, and they leave a very diverse sward behind them. They physically can't graze very low, so because they have to be able to wrap their tongues around the vegetation. They will also browse, but they predominantly will graze. So you've got ponies. So these are not ruminants, these are hindgut fermenters. So they've got teeth on the top and the bottom, incisors on top and the bottom, quite mobile, nimble lips, and they will graze quite short. Shorter, if not shorter than sheep. They will browse, and they'll take gorse and rush during the winter. They're designed to constantly eat low quality forage. And you've got sheep, again, similar, very similar in goats, dental pad at the top, incisors at the bottom, very mobile lips. They like to pick out herbs and fresh shoots, and they will also browse. So that's quite bad news for your herb species in your grassland. Very good at things like aftermath grazing, where you've taken a hay cut and then you want to graze it back down short and let the herb species come up in the spring. But best taken off if you want herb species to flourish. Here are some of the issues that different species will cause. I've got a slight cattle bias here because I haven't mentioned any of the issues that cattle cause, that mainly they would be poaching because they're very heavy animals. But if you can see here, this is an example of a lawn and latrine. This was a species-rich grassland, and unfortunately it had ponies on it horses on it for a very long time. Horses are much heavier than ponies, big feet, and they cause a lot of compaction. And also they will dung in one area and then they'll graze in another, because that's an adaptation to avoid re-ingesting parasites which are present in the dung. So they'll graze in areas that they don't dung, just so they can avoid that reinfection. Here's some Hebridean lambs, and they're eating flowers. So this is just an example of how sheep are very keen on eating high quality forage, and herbs and flowers are such, so they will have an impact. And goats mainly is keeping them where you want them, because they're very good climbers and very good at escaping. All right. So, so the timing of grazing is very important. So, as I mentioned before, you've got flowering plants which will start to grow in the spring, and they need to be able to flower and set seed. So, species-rich grassland needs to be able to flower and set seed, and species such as horses and sheep at high density will have an impact on the amount of flowering plants. Time of year, very similar. Winter grazing is important for a lot of species-rich grasslands, but you want to balance that with the amount of poaching that the animals will do, because compaction will alter the sward. Species of livestock, obviously, as we've been through, they will graze in very different ways. The class of livestock, so whether that's young stock, breeding stock, or barren, so empty stock that aren't breeding, they will have a slightly different energy requirements. So and they'll behave very differently. So young stock will tend to be a bit more energetic and lively, and perhaps not as safe on a site unless they've got an older animal to take care of them. And then and you've got breeding animals, which will have a slightly higher energy requirement because they'll be growing calves or foals or lambs. But they'll be a bit more sensible, and then their offspring will be born on the site and learn how to behave on that particular area. So they'll learn all about where to get food and water, and where to rest, where's safe, what plants are safe to eat. The number of animals obviously very important. You know, you can cause great damage by putting too high a number of animals on a site. And the stocking rate, we'll go through that a little bit later. And the stocking density. So yeah, very similar, we'll go through that a little later. And the length of grazing period, you know, rest is very important to allow the sward to recover. And right, so as I mentioned before, cattle and sheep and goats are ruminants, so they rely on the microbes within their gut to digest cellulose cell walls. Cattle are bigger, they've got greater capacity to eat lower quality forage. Sheep are smaller, and that's why they have to go for slightly more high energy, less cellulose rich forage. So the microbes in the gut will digest they'll digest the food, and they'll also wash in, the microbes themselves wash into the further down the digestive system, and they'll help to build muscle and produce milk, etc. And horses and donkeys are hindgut fermenters, so they also rely on microbes, but in the hindgut, and they're designed to eat a lot of low quality forage. They constantly produce gastric acid. They constantly need to be filling their gut with low quality forage. You get a problem obviously with native breeds. They're very good at surviving in areas with low quality forage, and then you get problems which is similar to a diabetes type condition called laminitis. So that's really can be very dangerous, and causes them a lot of pain, and they might not, they'll never be right after they've got it. So you know, growing ponies, so young stock, they are less at risk, and mares who are in foal are also using more energy, so they're less prone. But any pony which doesn't have additional energy requirements is at risk of contracting laminitis. So it's really important to have a seasonal fluctuation in weight, so they lose a bit of weight in the winter, so they don't get insulin resistance. So also it's really important to consider what the livestock are used to. So these are continental cross beef cattle, but they're used to living on common land. This is New Bridgend. So they're used to behaving in the environment they were born in. They know exactly where everything is. They're used to any disease that they might have present here. They know which plants to eat and not to eat. They know how to be safe on the roads, etc. And also their rumens will have adjusted to the vegetation that they've been eating since they were a calf. So it's very important to consider where your animals have come from, because if they've been used to just living in a shed and being fed grain, they won't be as suited, despite their breed, to conservation grazing, utilising low quality forage. So there's a lot of pressures on farmers to produce a particular weight of animal with a particular fat class very quickly. So for cattle, you have to, a farmer strives to produce them under 30 months, because that's a limit that the slaughterhouse puts on you. And for sheep, you have to try and produce lambs in under 5 months, sort of commercially. So that's why it's difficult for a lot of commercial farmers to do conservation grazing, because they have to they're constrained by these constraints. So with native breeds or cattle that are finished off conservation ground, they might take a lot longer, but they're lower input, so lower cost. But the farmer has to have a suitable output and has had to weigh that up when they're designing their business plan. So livestock units are a useful guide, but they're not the be all and end all. So often, you have to be adaptable. You can change. You don't take them, as gospel. For example, we often regard ponies as 0.6 of a livestock unit and cow at 1, but actually there's evidence to suggest that ponies actually take 63% more forage weight for weight than a cow. So, it's something, certainly a useful guide, but you should be careful with it. Different breeds and species have different resistance to, or different susceptibility to parasites. So horses don't get this parasite called fluke, which sheep and goats and cattle will in wet areas. So that's a consideration. If you've got a really wet area, you want to make sure you've considered that. There are some diseases, like I mentioned, laminitis, which ponies might get on certain sites. Cattle and sheep don't get that. Toxic plants, so some species are more susceptible to toxic plants than others. So sheep can be particularly susceptible to hemlock water dropwort, which is what's in this picture here. And then you've got ragwort, which cattle and horses are very susceptible to, but sheep can be used to graze that in the winter because they don't seem to be susceptible to it, and they usually don't live long enough to feel the effects of any prolonged build-up of the plant in their liver. Different animals are subject to different animal movement legislation. So horses aren't subject to any animal movement legislation, so they'd be really useful for moving onto sites where it's difficult to set up the necessary county parish holding number, for example, which you need to for cattle. Or in areas where there's high bovine TB risk. You can use ponies or sheep because obviously they don't come under the same restrictions as cattle would. The age class is important to consider when checking. So if you've got a suckler herd, so a breeding herd of cattle, or you've got sheep who are due to lamb, you've got to check them a lot more frequently than you would. You'd get away with checking once a day for most other ages. Life stages of livestock. So water, cattle need a lot of water. So if you've got a site with limited water availability, cattle might not be suitable. Horses also drink a fair amount, but sheep and goats definitely drink a lot less. Handling. So again, this is about what your livestock are used to. So sometimes it's really useful to have very, very tame animals, which you can see in these pictures. Really useful for getting them under very unusual sites. This is an island which the sheep travel to over there, so you wouldn't have managed to get a sort of more flighty animal onto that boat. And it's useful to have tame livestock to get your hands on and check for any issues. The problem with some is that they might become over friendly. So if there's public access on a site, they could be a little bit dangerous, especially if people are feeding them and they might kick out, etc. Handling cattle, for example, you need suitable cattle handling facilities. As you can see here, this crush is definitely not suitable for Dexter's very small breed of cattle. They tend to be a little on the flighty side. And they manage to get over, under and through anything, well, most things that you try to use to handle them. And then if you've got horned breeds, you have to consider that you have the right handling facilities for them, because they won't fit through some of the more commercial handling systems. You have to consider dogs and public access, particularly when you're thinking about grazing. If there's a footpath or it's a very public site, you've got issues with dog mess, which can transmit a very nasty disease called neosporosis, which causes infertility in cattle, and there are other diseases that dog mess transmits to sheep. So that can be very dangerous and very costly for the grazier or for yourself if you own them. Also, dog chasing, dog worrying, very big problem for sheep, causes them a lot of stress, can cause abortion or ill thrift in the livestock. So really important consideration, and also that your cattle or particularly cattle or horses are used to people and they're not going to pose a threat to anyone walking through. Best be very careful with cows with young calves. Perhaps that's not the best choice for a site with a busy footpath, for example. So a few case studies. This is Overton Mere on Gower, so a site with coastal heath and limestone grassland. It hadn't been grazed for 36 years. It's owned by the Wildlife Trust of South and West Wales, and we put together a plan to get it grazed. So we decided that we needed to cut some escape routes, which also acted as to clear the gorse in order to bring back the heathland. So we chose to cross graze different species. We chose cattle to graze the longer sward and keep the limestone grassland in good nick, and also to find their way into the dense scrub, which they very much did. You can see here this is a Dexter tunnel. So we turned out Dexter cattle there, first of all over winter, because it's very quiet there in the winter. It's a site with public access on the Wales Coast Path, so very busy. So we chose some very quiet heifers, and also we chose Welsh Mountain ponies to graze alongside them, so that they would take any of the the gorse regrowth. So grazing them in the winter, there's especially alongside the cattle, meant that there wasn't that much grass for them to eat, so they had to go and graze the gorse. We've slightly altered the plan now, so the cattle will be there in the summer now that they're used to the site. It's a site where my cattle have picked up neosporosis, so we will only graze non-breeding stock there in future. But the ponies will be there over winter then to tackle the gorse. And you can see that it's an absolutely amazing place. The limestone grassland's beautiful, and hopefully we'll get a lot more feeding opportunities for chaff as we progress. Got Kenfig National Nature Reserve. This is near Bridgend in South Wales. I'm afraid most of my examples are South Wales based. So this is the stronghold for the fen orchid in Wales, or certainly in the UK, I believe. So it's grazed by a commercial farmer, a very much commercial farmer, and he uses native breed and native crossbreed cows, suckler cows, and he puts a continental, so a more modern breed onto the cows, and then produces a crossbred calf which will grow a lot quicker. So you can see here he's got North Devon Ruby cattle, which are very hardy breed, and this is a Highland cow, and then you've got some Hereford cross cows in the background there. So he grazes them there for most of the year, and also he'll winter graze with Welsh Mountain sheep. So he keeps a flock of pure Welsh Mountain sheep here in the winter, where they're not going to pose a risk to flowering plants, but they'll keep scrub under control, and the burnet rose, which has become quite dominant. And they're also just about to embark on a trial of geofencing collars in order to graze the dune slacks with the fen orchid. So this is Cadwraeth Heath in Swansea. So it's an urban heath, and slight misnomer, I suppose, because it's got a lot of horse pasture, which would be suitable for Marsh Fritillary butterfly. It's been ungrazed for a very long time. It poses a big it's a big fire risk because it's got a huge fuel load. The Mynydd is very dominant, and catches fire most years. So we were involved with a project to fence off part of the heath, which isn't common land, and it's backs onto Swansea Community Farm. So there's, you can't see in this picture, but there's a lot of Himalayan balsam that comes up here in the summer, and you know, a lot of dominant Mynydd, but also a lot of devil's bit scabious. So it should be suitable and very close to the Marsh Fritillary populations in the north of Swansea. So Swansea Community Farm turn out goats, which they'll use in the summer to tackle the scrub and the Himalayan balsam. These are boar goats, so a commercial meat breed, but they'll be trying some more primitive breeds in future. And this is a Mediterranean donkey, and so they graze in a very similar way to horses, but they'll take slightly rougher vegetation as well. So they've been doing a great job since they were turned out. This is another example of grazing a habitat for Marsh Fritillary. This is triple SI in Carmarthenshire, and this is a suckler herd of Hereford cattle, very docile breed. As you can see, they're looking very, very well, and they do very well on a relatively poor forage, so poor quality forage, which is great news because they'll reduce the dominant Mynydd and allow devil's bit scabious to thrive, and in turn create better habitat for the Marsh Fritillary butterfly. Yet another Mynydd site. This is a common on Caeau, South Wales, and this is an example where we've turned out native crossbred cattle, and the aim of this is to produce high quality beef at the end of it for shareholders that have pre-bought a share in the cattle. We're using a native cross so that they'll finish relatively quickly, because we're a high TB risk area, so we want to make sure that we don't keep the cattle longer than we have to, and also most of your costs are incurred keeping cattle over the winter, so we want to make sure that we can finish them and they go off to slaughter in the autumn, to avoid keeping TB testing them again, and then also keeping them over winter. And also that's when they look at their best, because they've had all summer feeding on the Mynydd, which then starts to die off and reduce in quality after August, after it's flowered. So this is an Aberdeen Angus cross Highland. So we've got all steers, so all castrated males, so there's no risk of them going in calf or having to wander off and look for ladies. And they've done very well, very docile cattle as well. And this year we've got belted Galloways. We've got a problem on the common with New Forest eye, which is a bacterial condition that's spread by flies. And the native breeds like the Galloway, so this is belted Galloway up here, and the Highlands, they've got much thicker, denser eyelashes, so it should keep the flies off to a greater extent. Also, their coat is very thick and double layered, so it keeps the weather off, and it means that they retain their weight much better, and they're much easier to handle. And we make sure that we keep these, we feed them and make sure that when they're on private land, before they go out onto the common, to make sure that they come to the bucket, so it makes them a lot easier to handle and bring it in and out of on and off the common. So we've come to the end now, and I think it's really important to preserve our native breeds. So if you want to look at the Rare Breed Survival Trust website and look at their watch list, we need to make sure we retain our native breeds and all the genetic diversity and the interest and the heritage that goes along with them. So I think that's very important. So now we'll hand over to Owen, and he'll tell us all about Section A ponies.
Thank you, Emma. So I'm just going to put my presentation up on the screen.
Thanks.
Here we go. So hopefully you can see my screen. So my name's Owen Griffiths. I live in West Wales in the county of Ceredigion, which is Cardiganshire in English. We've been keeping Welsh ponies and cobs as a family since I was born. My grandfather had them before me, and also my great uncle as well. So the family mainly had Welsh cobs, but more recently I've come into Section A's, and with Section A's, they're very easy to keep. You can keep them out all winter. They're very low maintenance. They actually do better outside than inside, in my opinion. So like I said, low maintenance. So they're an ideal breed if you're a very busy person. So I work full time, but with the Section A's, I check them quite regularly, and they're very content outside. I've got a short video to show or to share with you of my Welsh Mountain ponies. I had this commissioned just over a year ago, back in 2019 it was, before COVID, and I did a talk out in the US, and I took this with me. So instead of me having to explain what Wales looked like, I thought what I'd do is I'll contact a friend of mine, Amanda, who used to work for the BBC and S4C. She lives in West Wales, and so I commissioned her to do this piece for me.
Owen, before you continue, can I
Yep.
suggest that you reshare your screen without
right.
the optimized setting for your
right, okay.
PowerPoint? Thank you.
Yep. Would you like me to replay the video?
Hi, Owen. No, the video is perfect, and just the presentation would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. So here we go then, a little bit of history on the Welsh Mountain ponies. So the Welsh Mountain ponies have been in Wales for many years. The Welsh stud book was started back in 1901, so it came out in 1902. Back then there weren't many registered, but even though this, for hundreds of years, Welsh Mountain ponies ran wild throughout the country, and in fact they became quite a nuisance for the hill shepherds. So actually there was an effort to get rid of them, and King Henry VIII, 1509, 1547, he then brought in a law to get rid of all ponies. So all stallions under 15 hands and all mares under 13 hands. He ordered that they were all destroyed. Luckily for the mountain ponies, many of them escaped the slaughter by escaping to the hills of Wales. So then this helped them become the hardy breed they are today. It was very much a survival of the fittest. So only those who could survive the bleak winter conditions on these hills, in fact, survived. So, for example, Henry VIII, he referred to these mountain ponies as being nags of small stature. What he wanted was an animal capable of going to war. So the mountain ponies didn't quite fit that bill for him. So the Welsh breeds, they're divided into 4 separate sections. You've got section A's, B's, C's and D's. They go up in sections and they go up in height. The smallest is the section A. It's no bigger than 12 hands 2, which is 128 centimeters. Section B then is considered to be the riding pony, and it doesn't exceed 13 2 hands. Section C then has a bit more substance to it. Same height limit as the section B, being 13 2, but obviously the way they look is slightly different. On the screen at the moment, though, this is how they divide them initially back in 1901. Since then, there has been a few changes to the different sections. So, for example, the section C's could be 13 2 to 14 2, and the cobs then 14 2 to 15 2 and upwards. However, nowadays, section B's and C's are no bigger than 13 2 hands. The cobs then are 13 2 with no height limit. So before the Welsh stud book, you had the Polo pony stud book, and in 1984, the first Welsh pony was registered. You can see the animal here on the right, Welsh fashion. So dare I say it, she looks possibly a bit like a Shetland, and this could well be down to the influence of other breeds. So the purpose of the stud book and the Welsh Pony Cob Society was to make sure that the breed was kept pure and to preserve this breed for generations to come. I should probably highlight as well that everything I do say is my opinion and not that of any other organisation or society. So alongside the mare here, you've got the Polo Pony stud books. So these predated the Welsh stud books, which came into force from 1902 onwards. So on the screen now, you can see the Welsh Mountain Pony developed into a hardy breed due to the harsh climate, limited shelter and sparse food sources of the native country. At some point in the development, the Welsh breeds had some Arab blood added, although this did not take away the physical characteristics that make the breed unique. So these are the characteristics of a Welsh Mountain Pony, which I think make them quite unique and quite ideal for conservation grazing. So they've got small feet, so in the winter they don't make much mess. They're quite sure-footed as well. They're very good doers, so they don't need much high quality forage in the winter. They'll do well on dry grass and without the need for any hard feed. Like I mentioned earlier, over the years it's been survival of the fittest, so they've become a very hardy breed, and that's part of their genetic makeup. In the winter, you'll notice that they've got very thick coats, they've got plenty of mane, tail and feather, which helps break the wind. So I quite like this quote. If anybody has further interest in Welsh Mountain Ponies, a good reference or references would be books written by Dr. Wyn Davies. He's quite a learned individual and he's quite an authority on the breed, and he's documented the life history of the Welsh Mountain Pony as well as the other sections in his numerous books. Some of these books, of course, focus on Welsh Mountain Ponies. I particularly like this quote though, and I think it's quite pertinent this evening to this talk on conservation. So Richard Green Price of Pristine in Radnorshire wrote, persecuted by laws, by starvation, dog driving, contaminated by gross carelessness in the mating, they survive where sheep and cattle only die. And we may wonder indeed that these little animals thrive in such a perfect state as we find them today in their native pastures. So finding these Section A's or Welsh Mountain Ponies graze conservation land is not surprising really, because they've been exposed to quite harsh conditions over the years, and as it says, they survive where sheep and cattle only die. around the turn of the 18th century, farmers began to realise that ponies and cobs could actually be an asset when grazed on the Welsh hills with sheep and cattle. And over time, the need for these animals increased, of course, because of farm work, but also co-grazing was found to be quite beneficial to these areas, the hills and dales of Wales. So further descriptions of the Welsh mountain ponies. So they were described as being like little thoroughbreds with their summer coats and tiny shires with their winter jackets on. Limbs clean, fine, flat and hard as flint, with a small, hard, round foot that stood no end of work unshod. Lovely little heads on beautifully turned necks and a fine sloping shoulder that kept a saddle in its place and narrow enough for a child's small legs. So that was taken from one of the Welsh Pony Cob Society journals in 1964, and I think Jean Houghton kind of summarises the breed to a T. Here now I've got, it says Bay until 1894. In 1984, something quite major happened. It was the year a certain stallion was born, and that particular stallion, which I'll refer to later, was grey, and his influence on the breed was quite drastic, actually. So up until 1894, most of the Welsh mountain ponies were of solid colours, bays, blacks, duns. So for example, in the first stud book, you had 9 stallions and 273 mares. Of the stallions, 1 grey, whereas the others were dark coloured, mainly bays and browns. And then of the mares, 66% were bay, brown and black, 14% were chestnut, 8% were roan, 4% were cream or dun, and the others of unrecorded colour. There is an old saying as well, it's in Welsh, I'll recite it. Y coch yw'r lliw I bara, bydd y coch I lew, rhowch chwarae teg i'r coch, mae'r coch yn siŵr o fyw, which loosely translates to mean that bay colour is very hardy and a very persistent colour in future generations. There is a story as well, an old anecdote that one year, probably around 1800, it was a very hard winter, and up on one of the hills in Wales, you had a mixture of greys, bays, blacks, all colours, okay? All the bays survived, whereas all the greys died, which kind of suggests really that possibly the bay colour is more hardy, genetically more hardy. There is talk, or it's reputed that the grey is from Arab influence, but of course that can't be confirmed without DNA testing, and with these animals back in 1894, we're not going to go back in time, are we? So obviously it's all anecdotal, but one mountain pony, his name was Dair Starlight, he is pictured here. The Welsh mountain pony, its purest state, is under 12 hands. It can be best described as being an Arab in miniature, and that was how he was described, or how they were described as a breed in the first Welsh stud book in 1902. So Dair Stud was based in Caeau, near, well, in Carmarthenshire, and gentleman on the left is Merrick Lloyd. So if you look at his stud name, if you turn that back to front, so Dair is Lloyd backwards, and he had a very large house in Caeau, Glanranell Park. So if we go on then, so yeah, Dair Starlight, he was the turning point, 1894. So when I said earlier, all grey until 1894, that's when Dair Starlight was born. The mother was believed to be grey, but the father, there was rumour that he was an Arab called Apricot, and there's been a lot of controversy over his parentage over the years. He was probably the most famous Welsh mountain pony of all time. He, in fact, ended up in Spain. He was sold at a very old age to Spain by Lady Wentworth. So Lady Wentworth I believe she inherited him from Mary upon his death, and the agreement was that he would never be sold on, but unfortunately he slipped through the net and he went to Spain for £800. Back in those days, that would be a lot of money. He also had a very famous son called Greylight. Greylight then went out to Australia. He was sold for £1,000. I think it was back in early 19, possibly 1919 or something like that. So he's winning at the Royal Show in 1914. So I think it was around 1919 he went out to Australia. So back then, £1,000 was a formidable sum. So we've had a bit of history on the breed. What I wish to share with you now are some pictures of the ponies I have, which graze coastline and also land which is further inland. So if you see this mare then, this mare, she's, well, at the moment she's 24 years old. She still looks like that actually. She hasn't aged at all. In fact, as she gets older, she seems to be getting better in appearance. So I inherited her at an old age. I think she was around 19 when I had her. I didn't think she would make it to this day because obviously anything which approaches 20 years old, every additional year then is a bonus, I guess. But this particular mare, she seems to thrive on this coastline. She's actually in the foal again this year, and she's looking exactly the same as she is there. So lives out all winter. It's very exposed where she is, but they seem to know where to be when the wind blows from certain directions. So you can pretty much tell or say where the wind is coming from based on where the ponies are. And they seem to enjoy it there very much. So this is another piece of land further down the coast. Again, the forage isn't high nutrient, but the mares always do well on it, and mountain ponies are ideal for this kind of pasture land. Just another picture again from the coastline. So this is a mare coming out of winter. So coming out of winter, you would normally expect the ponies to have lost quite a bit of condition. This one doesn't seem to have lost that much. And again, it's quite exposed where they are, but they're born to be in these places. And if you think back to when they escaped to the hills of Wales, I guess the conditions would have been a lot worse. This is another piece of land. I try and keep a stallion with a mare or two over the winter. It keeps him content. If he was on his own, he probably would want to find company. So keeping them in small packs. So I think the piece of land was around possibly 20 acres. I only had 3 ponies there, but I think that's sufficient. So what that means then is that you don't even notice that they're there, and the ponies do well at the same time. Back on the other side then is the other piece of land near the coast. Again, the mares do very well. In fact, I think they do better on the coastline than anywhere else. I think it could be down to the salt in the air. So there must be a high level of minerals in the ground, and they always seem to be doing well. And quite often these mares, they're in foal as well. That's me. I think this was around October time. So as you can see, there's plenty of forage there, plenty of ground underfoot. These 2 mares are in foal, and then the stallion then, he's there just to keep them company and to keep him content. Mountain ponies do much better outside in the winter, like I said previously, so I try to make sure that the stallions are left outside as much as possible as well. A few more pictures of the land. So as you can see, the ground isn't high nutrients, but as we saw before, the Section A's do particularly well on it. Again, a cold morning. I think this was around 6:30 in the morning, actually, before work. I popped down to see them, and they seem very content. Again, the same three from a different angle in a different part of the land. But with ponies, as long as they've got clean running water, as long as you've got a good boundary as well with no neighbouring horses, I don't think horses do particularly well if the ground is very, very wet and they're knee deep in mud. Also, it's quite important they have enough shelter if they want to as well. If they've got shelter, it means then that they can keep in more heat, or they can hide from the wind, so they don't cool down as much. So this is going back to the coastline again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep, so there's 8 there. I think I'm allowed around 10 on this particular piece of land. And again, it's organic land. It's only grazed by horses all year round. And the fact that it's very dry and well draining means that the ground doesn't cut up. And what tends to happen if the ground is very, very wet, the feather tends to burn. So they tend to lose the feather. So as a person who likes Section A's, feather is quite a quality that you look for in a Section A. So you want to try and keep that as much as possible. So it's in my interest to find land which is dry for them. Again, the stallion and 2 mares midwinter. This was probably around December time. Again, they're looking well. They probably lost a bit of condition compared to when they went there, but that's not a bad thing. Otherwise, when they come out of winter, you want them to have lost some condition. Otherwise, it'll lead to trouble such as laminitis, as Emma mentioned earlier. And this is the stallion. So he's very calm, very quiet, because he's with 2 other mares. If he was on his own, maybe he wouldn't be as mentally happy, but he seems very content. So yeah, just to end then. So this mare we saw earlier throughout the winter on one of the conservational grazing blocks I have. And a few weeks back, she gave foal to a filly, and the father we saw earlier as well. So I've now obviously brought her home. I normally take them away from the stallion 2 months before they're due to foal, just to make sure that there's no interruption from the stallion. However, some people like to leave the stallions out all year round. I tend not to do that. So this is the result then of grazing conservation land over the winter. So this foal is probably, I think it was only 2 or 3 days old here, but she's very sharp and very inquisitive as well. So that's the presentation. So I'll stop the screen share.
Thank you, Owen. That was fascinating. That was a great insight into how into Welsh Mountain ponies and how you do your conservation grazing. Thank you very much. Look forward to chatting to you in the panel discussion afterwards. So now I'm going to attempt to share a video of Amanda Evans from the Caeau Mawr project.
My name's Amanda Evans. I work for Carmarthenshire County Council as a conservation officer, working on the Caeau Mawr project, which is a landscape scale marsh fritillary project in the Crosshands area of Carmarthenshire. The Crosshands area of the county is a growth area and also contains the Caeau Mawr special area of conservation, which is designated for the habitat which supports the marsh fritillary butterfly. My project is funded through contributions from development in the area, and this money is then used to manage sites within the area for the marsh fritillary butterfly. We have 26 sites which I manage for the project for the marsh fritillary butterfly. Most of those are managed by grazing, which is the best sort of management on marshy grassland for the butterfly. PONT's been instrumental in sorting out grazing on the more difficult sites. We also, Carmarthenshire is a big dairy area, so we use pedigree dairy cattle to graze some of the sites. As you can see in the background here, they do a great job of grazing the habitat. As you can see on this site, we've got pedigree dairy cattle grazing here. Not the sort of stock you traditionally associate with grazing on a conservation site, but actually they do a really good job. These are young heifers. Their nutritional requirements are less than if they were being milked, so they do fine here. It also works brilliantly for me because the farmer is local. It helps him with a little bit of extra grazing land, and he's able to manage the stock quite closely and move them off when I need them moved off. We also then don't have to worry about winter grazing because they're housed over winter. Another one of my sites just down the road from here, the land is actually adjacent to the farm where they milk, so they graze the dry cows on those fields. It suits the farmer because they're close by. He can keep an eye on them as they're coming up closer to calving and move them off as he needs to. On another one of my sites, we've got what you'd expect to find on grazing on marshy grassland more. It's native breed beef cattle. Obviously they do a great job of managing the habitat, but the farmer also has benefits from it because he actually fattens the cattle on the grass. They're not fed any hay or any extra feed at all, and they're overwintered there, but obviously on a really low stocking density. It also benefits the farmer because we can actually offer him year-round grazing. Quite often we only want summer grazing on marshy grassland, and it's really hard to find graziers who are only looking for summer grazing and not winter. So we've got a great system there where the cattle are on the drier fields in the winter, and then they're moved on to wetter marshy grassland fields in the summer. Another breed that you would traditionally associate with conservation grazing is semi-feral ponies. We've got Caeau ponies grazing on a few sites. They do a particularly good job on quite difficult sites, and they're great for grazing the rushes, so they can be good for winter grazing where rush is a problem. On another one of my sites, I've got 3 miniature Shetland ponies grazing. They're my little furry troubleshooters. They're great because they're halter trained, they're really easy to manage and move around, and I tend to use them on smaller sites where we have to move stock a lot. Also, they're really hardy, and again they graze all year round, which again helps the owner of the ponies, but also helps me because it works brilliantly on drier sites to have some winter grazing. I've started trialling alpaca grazing on a couple of sites as well. Again, they're nice and easy to handle because they're halter trained and easy to move around. I'm not convinced how good they are for conservation grazing because they do tend to sort of dung in one area of the site, but they're certainly good for eating rushes, and they don't seem to selectively graze the devil's bit scabious, which is what you would expect from sheep grazing. In conclusion, I guess basically it's just important to work with whatever stock's available. You know, it's nice to have native breed stock if we can, and that's also helping to promote native breeds, particularly with the cattle, but it's not always practical. I mean, here in Carmarthenshire it's a big dairy area, so I've got dairy cattle grazing on quite a few sites and it works well. It's just important to work with the grazier and to manage the grazing carefully.
Now we'll hear from Jane Bisset, and Brian Briggs in a video about the lapwing, the conservation grazing at Wildfire and Wetlands Trust for lapwing. And then I'll follow for that with another video from Jane.
I'm Brian. I'm the reserve manager here at the Wildfire and Wetlands Trust in Fritillary, and we're currently sat on an island in the main lake on the nature reserve. And for the last couple of years, we've had some sheep join us on the island. It's an area that we've seen, unfortunately, declines in some of our breeding birds, in particular wading birds called lapwings, and it's a nationwide decline that to the extent that now this is one of only 2 places in Carmarthenshire where lapwing breed, and so we've been doing some work to try and reverse that decline. And in 2015 we did a lot of scrub clearance on this island where we're sitting here. We've got the remains of the stumps of the trees and a lot of the scrub around us. But to be able to manage this island in the long term, then stop it just reverting straight back to scrub, we needed to think about ways that we could manage it sustainably, and the obvious solution was animals. Now, because it's an island, we couldn't get cattle or ponies out here. We only had a little rowing boat, so the obvious choice was to look for some sheep that would be willing to eat well, anything other than fresh green grass, which is the one thing we don't have much of out here. So we use grazing animals around the nature reserve here and have done for many years. We have cattle in some of our marshy grassland and on the salt marsh, and ponies in some other pasture land. But finding a grazier who would be willing to put animals in this kind of habitat, in this less conventional grazing habitat, was going to be a bit of a challenge. Fortunately, through our local nature partnership, I found out about PONT, an organisation which helps to promote conservation grazing, and Emma Douglas at PONT quickly got on board and started to help us in a number of different ways, most importantly to find a grazier for the island. But also that autumn she came and trained us in how to check sheep for health and also our other stock as well, so that we could then take on the role of you know, checking the animals when they were here, and make it more attractive for a grazier so that they could be a bit less hands-on on a day-to-day basis. So we were trained up, and then with Emma's help we found someone crazy enough to put their animals out on this island.
I'm Jane Bisset. I'm a shepherd and I live in the Vale of Glamorgan. For many years I did harbour a secret envy of the flying flock of Shetland sheep that go away doing conservation grazing, but of course where we live there's no real opportunities. So when I was approached by Emma at a show, in a show environment, to see if I would be interested, I secretly tried to be quite cool about it, but I jumped at the chance, and lured by the opportunity of sheep being able to travel to an island by a boat, who could refuse? So I came over and had a look. It's been a wonderful project. It's lovely to see Shetland sheep being able to graze in what would be their natural habitat. It's lovely to have them in lowland conditions, but to see them doing the job that they've sort of been bred for, really, real back to nature type of thing, is really rewarding. I thoroughly enjoyed the experience, knowing that the sheep have come to a good, safe environment. The people that are here have taken me on board very much as one of the team. I've taken them on board very much as one of the team, and I rely on them an awful lot to do their job as stock checkers, which gives me the confidence of knowing when the sheep are here, even though I come to check them as often as I can. That is literally every 6-8 weeks. While they are here, that I know I'm only a phone call away, but more importantly they know that I'm only a phone call away. They've bonded with the sheep, they've made the project successful, they've had nature successes, and yeah, I'd recommend it to anybody. I've really enjoyed the experience, and I was delighted when it didn't end after the first year, and we're back again with more successes and different sheep, and they've settled in as quickly as the first flock. So we're hoping now that we're going to develop them with a nucleus of weathered Shetlands that will remain here for most of the year, and they will be joined by younger wethers, and then as it progresses, the older ones will leave the island, and we'll have hopefully a nice turnaround of sheep. When we first brought the sheep in April, it was a bit of an adventure for all of us. They were brought over to the island by boat, one at a time, which was a challenge to say the least. But when they arrived, they were lambs, and we had no expectation of how we thought the year was going to pan out, or indeed the first 6 months. So by the time we collected them, I was quite surprised when we got them home to see them having developed so successfully, looking so well. They were very, very fit, and they'd grown immensely, which is what I would have expected from lambs towards growing into shearlings. What I didn't expect was what happened next. They came into our normal health programme when I got them home, which was to check them for a worm burden, see if there's any potential worm burden, and to weigh them, which is what we do the rest of the flock. Well, I put the first one on the scales and swung it free. And then I swung it free again, because I quite didn't believe what was in front of me. They'd gained an enormous amount of weight. The majority of them were heavier than their peer group that were at home. They were phenomenally well, and when we sent away the fetal egg count, it came back with a ridiculously low score. So for the whole of their lambhood, they hadn't had any worming at all. They weren't carrying any significant worm burden, and they really were a picture of health. So because we had a peer group at home from the same ram, we decided it was a perfect opportunity for a little bit of a trial. So all the sheep were blood sampled, and that was cross-referenced, and the sheep that had been away on the conservation ground were higher in trace minerals than the ones at home, which was not something that we expected, and it was clearly a benefit. All information is good information, and I guess that I thought I was probably going to say that the experience has been brilliant. We thoroughly enjoyed it. There was nothing detrimental, but I certainly didn't expect it to be the success that it was. So when Brian invited us to come back the following year to do a follow-up, I just couldn't have been more pleased.
Grazing animals are an essential part of the wetland ecosystem, really. They would have been here long before we were, and without them we've got a situation where managing habitat like this is incredibly demanding on manpower in terms of the staff or volunteers, also fossil fuels and everything that we need to use to maintain this kind of vegetation by hand. And then even with that, we don't do it as well as animals do. Animals graze down certain areas very low, other areas will leave tussocky, whereas cutting it ourselves you tend to end up with a bit of a level habitat. And what the lapwing need is that combination of very short grazed grassland, tussocky areas that the chicks can hide in, and it's already proven a real success for us here. So 3 years ago, before we started working on the island, we were down to one pair of lapwings, sadly, on a separate little island, and no chicks for many years. 8 years in a row we'd had no chicks fledging. The year after we increased to 3 pairs and had our first 2 chicks fledge, and then this year, on the second year of grazing, we've increased from 3 pairs of lapwings up to 12 pairs, and we know that at least 9 of those fledged chicks. So it's incredible the curve we're on, and hopefully that's going to continue over the next few years. So yeah, I'm strongly hoping the sheep will be back next year.
It's thanks to PONT that I've been given this great opportunity to not only be a shepherd at home, but to be a shepherd away. I've really enjoyed being the owner of a conservation flock, and I'm really looking forward to it continuing for the years ahead, which I'm sure it will, because we've all forged a great bond with the sheep, a good relationship with the conservation work that the sheep are doing. Primitive sheep are perfect for this type of thing. I was I was pleased when I was approached by PONT. It was something I've always wanted to do. And I think really the icing on the cake for me was when I was asked to do a brief presentation at the annual conference, where I was able to meet other graziers, find out different experiences from different people, carrying on all the great work that PONT has started, continues to do, and has encouraged us all to do for the future. I think it's a great organisation. Without them, this conservation work wouldn't happen. Without them, our landscape wouldn't be what it is today. So I think with that in the future, we can only hope to improve on everything and look forward to the successes that we're going to have. I'm sure there's going to be many of them.
As well as the benefits to the wildlife, we feel like the project has had benefits for us as well. I mean, not only have I had less brush cutting to do on this island, but my staff and volunteers have really enjoyed the experience of checking the stock and helping to look after the sheep. You know, it's not been part of our role really to have that interaction with livestock before, and we've really enjoyed that and learned a lot from it as well. And one thing I've heard many times is our visitors talking about the sheep and loving, you know, having these animals to look at from the hides and from the screens around the place. They often think they're goats, but they love seeing the primitive breed, and they look so natural in the landscape, and it's definitely been interesting for them as well.
There's one thing that the project's taught me. It's the importance of conservation. It can be educational. We've been able to take it out to schools when we've done visits back at home, pass the message on and everything. I would absolutely recommend other people that have got any type of livestock that's suitable for conservation grazing, don't dismiss it out of hand. Go along, have a look. Even if you don't think it's suitable initially, which I don't think initially I did, but I wanted to really give it a go. Best decision I ever made. And if there is one thing that PONT's taught me, that's grazing really is amazing.
Yeah, that's a lovely video from Jane and Brian there. So that was filmed a few years ago, but we've had a few years of grazing since then, and we've continued with the project and added pony grazing during the summer to take some of the rush down. So in 2017, as Brian said, there were 3 lapwing nests. That was when the first year of grazing, 2 fledged. 2018, 11 nests and 9 fledged. 2019, 23 nests, 27 fledged. 2020, circa 30 nests, but there at least 6 fledged, but unfortunately cold spell of weather knocked most of the chicks out. This year they're looking really good, but they've had some hedgehog predation issues, but it's continuing to look up for the lapwing, so that's really good news. So I'm going to share a little update from Jane now. This will be a last video, and then we'll go on to our panel discussion. Thank you.
My name is Jane Bisset, and I am the shepherd and owner of Kennixton Sheep. We've been involved in conservation grazing now for a number of years, and we graze an island up at the Waterfowl and Wetland Trust at Llanelli. At the moment, we're just getting the sheep ready to go back out to their grazing site. You can see the sheep behind me. We have Shetlands, boris, which are the main 2 breeds that we use for conservation. We have other breeds of sheep here, but they are more modern breeds. The best breeds really that we found for the conservation work are the older breeds, the primitive sheep, because they've got all the things, all the attributes that we need to be able to deal with the type of grazing that they need. They are browsers rather than grazers. So they go out, they're able to do the job and eat a lot of the stuff that the more modern breeds are not quite so partial to. So in getting them ready for the job that they're doing in the summer, first of all we select the sheep that are going there. The first year we had a self-selected group of 6, which were really what we felt at the time were ones that could deal with conservation grazing, because we didn't know how it was going to work out. Since then, we've looked at it very much from a business viewpoint. They came back, the health of the sheep was phenomenal. They then went into the food chain. The taste of the meat was amazing. It was sustainable, it was wildlife friendly, it ticked all the boxes that we wanted to tick to produce the best quality meat that we could, and we have found that it has helped us to do that. So in preparing for them to go, we select the sheep that we're looking at putting into the food chain further along the line, and that includes some of the older ones that have had some years experience over at the conservation project, and they go as mutton. So at the moment now, you can probably see some of the sheep in the background are looking a little less woolly than others. So we make sure before we go out that they all have a health check. So they are all sheared, they're all prepared against fly strike, their feet are trimmed, and we want to make sure that the stock checkers are confident in the stock that's arriving. We don't want anything to arrive with any problems. Very lucky at Fritillary, we have amazing stock checkers. They keep an eye on the sheep, and they build up a very good rapport with them and good relationship with them over the summer. After the first year that we were there, it was such a success that they built a corral. This has worked wonderfully well for us, because we're able to take the sheep up there and they don't just go straight immediately onto land as they did the first year. It also means there's more of a control function for the stock checkers, and it gives them confidence. So if there's an animal that they want to have a closer look at, something they feel is not quite right, they can get the flock to come straight over, and they're happy to do that. So we found it's been really useful for us. It's been additional grazing that we weren't looking at, and the success story with the lapwings, which is why we're there. We're very, very proud to be associated with that, and it's something that we have brought it to the flock. We brought it home. We've used it when we've gone out and done educational visits, and it's just been amazing. We've really thoroughly enjoyed it.
Lovely. That was a nice little video from Jane. Over to Cassie.
Thank you so much to everybody, Emma, Owen, Jane and Amanda, for fabulous presentations. My mind is boggling with all the information. It's fantastic. So we have got some questions coming in. Well, actually, the first one I've had, this was somebody who was unable to attend this evening's session, and they wanted to know more about their interest in alpaca grazing. So I know we've covered that a little bit, but I wonder whether anybody else from the panel could mention a bit more about alpaca grazing, please. We might need panelists to come off mute and to put their videos back on, please.
In my limited experience of alpaca grazing, that being what Amanda mentioned in her video, they seem to. They like to browse, so they're good for keeping scrub under control. They also like to take rush. But as Amanda mentioned, they sort of have these latrine areas which they keep, and they produce, well, a lot of dung, and they pile it up in certain areas. So yeah, I mean, they seem to, as Amanda mentioned, not be particularly selective and not select herbs, but I think the jury's still out on that. We'll have to do some more research.
More studies, more people investigating that then. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Emma. Hilary, did you have anything to add to that?
No, not really. I haven't got much experience with alpacas. I just know one end spits and the other end kicks.
Okay, thank you. I'll go on to the next question then. We have, well, in fact, we've got Dawn who's posted about biogoats to rent, and she has actually popped something in the chat, but about conservation grazing. So if anybody wants to check that out, her web address is in the chat there. Okay, question from John Lation. Do they still do roundup of wild ponies in the Tregaron area and hold informal rodeos with the wild animals? Perhaps a question for Owen.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest. It's not something I've heard of before. I know they collect ponies off the mountains and off the Caeau. the rodeo part I'm not too familiar with, if I'm honest with you. Is this quite a few years back, or is it quite recent that you've come across this?
I think there's photos in the Talbot of the rodeo. I don't think it runs anymore. There's only one left in Wales, I believe. And it's not in Tregaron.
Okay, thank you. Next question. To all the panelists here, which animals are easiest to keep if you're a beginner?
I'll start then if you want. So
Thank you.
ponies, they're quite easy to keep, but then having said that, I've been exposed to ponies all my life. Obviously, there are certain things you have to do. You have to make sure that if they need worming, you've got to make sure that their feet are in good form as well. Sometimes if they're on wetland, particularly in the winter, their feet can grow quite long, so you want to keep them trimmed back. You just want to make sure that they're in good health, really, so you've got to check them quite frequently. You know, I guess sometimes things can happen. They can get spooked, potentially. They could get stuck somewhere. So just kind of checking them on a regular basis, just making sure that they've got fresh water. Quite often that's in the form of a river or something that goes through the field, and just making sure that they look healthy more than anything. So if a horse doesn't look healthy, then obviously there's something wrong and you need to see to that. But generally ponies are very easy to keep, particularly the Welsh mountain ponies. As you go bigger in size, obviously it gets harder. So cobs, for example, they're a lot bigger, so you need more land for them. Quite possibly you'd have to bring them in winter as well. But Welsh mountain ponies are certainly easy to keep.
Thank you, Owen. And is that unanimous across the panel, or do we have a difference of view here?
I think it's probably unanimous, because cattle, you've got to sort of be concerned about TB and have facilities for testing things, and sheep, their aim in life is to die expensively. But you've got to balance what you're having them for. So I think Emma and I would say cattle are the best for conservation grazing, and maybe start with some quiet Herefords, and there'd be a good starting point.
Fantastic. Anything to add, Emma?
I agree, really. I mean, with both Owen and Hilary, also horses aren't subject to any movement restrictions, and you don't have to have a county parish holding number. You don't have to have all of the complicated things that you have to do to set up with cattle or sheep or goats. So I'd say that, yeah, ponies are probably a good start, but be really careful and ask for advice off an expert. Make sure you're doing it right.
If you're doing it for conservation grazing management, then you've got to be quite careful with your pony grazing and pick up after them and move them around and allow land to rest in between grazing. Otherwise, they'll just give you a lawn.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Another question from Andrew Martin. Do grazers eat soft rush? Emma, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, so soft rush is something we're very familiar with in South Wales, and we graze sites with ponies in the winter because the feed value in the rush is better than the surrounding vegetation on the whole if you're grazing sort of marshy grassland. So the ponies will take that preferentially, particularly native breed ponies, and obviously I'm biased towards Welsh ponies. They will take it. Strangely, the alpacas also do eat soft rush. I'm not sure if that's strange or not, actually. But and also cattle, particularly native breed cattle, will eat it, and particularly if it's been cut and it's regrowth, it's very palatable. But you know, ponies and cattle will take it if it's a little bit more, a little tougher as well.
I think goats will take it as well. They'll actually eat it right down into the roots, won't they?
Good point.
It's just keeping them in the field where the rushes are might be an issue.
Thank you both. Okay, another question, anonymous question. Where do you put your animals if you want to have a wildflower meadow during the summer and you only have one field? Good practical question there.
I think Jan wanted to answer this one. Is she there?
Hi, Jan, if you can hear us, can you put your video on and take mute off? And while we're waiting for Jan to come, does anybody else have anything to comment on?
You could look, if you contact well, PONT or Natural Resources Wales National Trust, they might have opportunities for your livestock to go elsewhere during the periods that you don't want them grazing your meadow. That's a good start. Yeah, basically you sort of have to look for additional land, or you can subdivide your field and start to rotationally graze, but you're likely to not get the best benefit out of your from your well, you won't get as much species richness because you will start to increase your nutrients nutrients in the soil if you're grazing, set stock and grazing the same piece of ground for a long time.
I suppose it depends on the size of your piece of ground. If you've got a 10-acre field and you can split it into 4 and rotate them around it, well, you can, it comes down to really needing to split it, or maybe have 1 cow and have it at very low stocking rates, because you've got to think about your winter carrying capacity, really. So if it's best to stock to the maximum the land can carry in the winter, and then this is how farms work, that you then cut the spare ground in the summer when the production is much higher. So again, you're back down to having an electric fence, having 3 sheep to the acre, or sort of a quarter of a cow to the acre in the winter, and then putting an electric fence up and cutting the surplus grass, which would then improve your species variety and stuff.
Thank you. Guy Dyma'r says, in general, are cattle better for grazing fields that are pretty boggy with quite a lot of reed, and should such land be grazed in the summer too?
I would say cattle and ponies are equally as good for grazing. Well, cattle will produce a more uneven sward, which will create a lot of niches for various wildlife. Ponies also very good. They'll take all the vegetation that grows in very wet areas. The feed value, nutritional value reduces in the winter because you'll likely have millennia grass in that habitat, and therefore cattle won't really do that well on it during the winter, and they'll also likely to poach it more so because they're quite heavy animals. And ponies could be possibly a bit lighter, and they will actually take the rush during the winter. So, but it depends how wet your site is, and you need somewhere nice and dry for them to get out of the wet conditions. So it's not good for any livestock to have constantly wet feet, regardless of breed or species.
Yeah, I just agree with Emma, really. Yeah.
Thank you. Emma Williams asks, or says, Emma mentioned goats using Pacific latrine areas. I've observed ponies on Llantrisant Common also do this, but to the detriment of the site, as they're using an area that's waterlogged, but then want to build up a waste running off into a waterway. I've not seen this behaviour in any other site. Is this behaviour normal?
Yes. Quite not. Well, Hilary would say that Caeau don't to the same extent.
No,
right?
Quite a lot of Caeau ponies won't use a latrine. So the occasional one will, but they just seem to dung randomly. I don't know if it's some kind of a reaction to whether there might be leopards near the latrine or what, but it's just the Caeau ones that we've noticed this with.
And we've got another question about, okay, so which, would different animal types coexist well, or would you keep them separate normally? Big question to Owen. I think you're on mute, Owen. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm off. Yeah. So co-grazing, you mean then, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So it seems to be that ponies and sheep graze well together. So the ponies won't graze certain areas where they dung, and normally the sheep will come up then and graze those patches. So that seems to work very well. So Emma mentioned earlier as well about sheep and horses grazing closer to the ground. I know of one particular farmer. He's very successful as a sheep breeder. He's also very successful as a pony breeder as well. And he always sticks by the fact that his success derives from the fact that he co-grazes. And it just seems to be that it improves the ground, and both animals just get on very well together, I guess. I don't think there is an explanation for it. But certainly co-grazing is beneficial because, like I mentioned earlier, with horses, they don't graze all parts, whereas a sheep will. The only thing with the sheep, particularly on open ground where there's a footpath is, they tend to make a mess everywhere. With a horse, they'll dung in a certain part, so it keeps the ground a lot cleaner, I guess. And then obviously that area then leads to long grass, but then what you see then sometimes is some birds nesting in that long grass. So all the land I've got, I don't co-graze at all. I only graze with horses, or the majority is. And you know, like I said, in the winter though, you will notice that the areas that they don't graze in the summer, they do graze it in the winter when the forage becomes short. Yeah, so hopefully that answers the question.
Lovely, thank you, Owen. Guy asks, can ragwort become a big problem and how do you deal with it?
Yep, it is a problem, particularly for horses. It's toxic. A horse won't go out and eat ragwort. I guess it's probably got quite a sour or an unpleasant taste to it. So you won't see a horse graze ragwort. Once the ragwort dies, I think that's when it becomes toxic. If I see ragwort where the ponies are, I immediately pull it up. You've got to make sure that you use gloves when you pull it up and that you dispose of it properly. One way would be to burn it, of course. So yeah, the advice is if you see ragwort in a field of horses, you want to try and remove that ragwort as soon as possible.
Thank you. Do you have any advice on how to engage with the public to ensure they know the dangers of dog around cattle and the threat that poo has for their health?
We've had open days on, there's a site in Bangor that we graze with our cattle. It's a waxcap fungi reserve, SSSI, and it is in between 3 housing estates and 3 schools. And it's just 14 acres, and it obviously gets used quite a lot as a dog toilet. But it's got a really good friends of group, and they're really great at engaging with the public that are there. So that's one thing, is if you can get a friends of group for your area, and it's great if people in that group have got their own dogs and things, and they can just talk, because people with dogs speak to each other, don't they? So they can go, oh yeah, well, you know, I always pick up after my dog, because although you could just kick it into the hedge, you know, there's things like neosporosis and toxicara, and that might affect children as well. So, you know, I always clean up after mine. And then what we also do is hold a dog show every couple of years. We tried holding a come and talk to the farmers day, and I sat there all afternoon, nobody came. And then we held a dog show, and we had like 200 people, and we just got customized rosettes made up, and we got the Wildlife Trust and the RSPB and different community groups and a vet to come and sort of do a dog health chat to anybody who wants to ask any questions. And then I did, this is how you can come with me, and we'll walk past the cattle with your dogs, and I'll show you what you need to do, and that you do need to let them go if they come after you, but you know, you can walk and just don't engage with them and keep out of the way. And that's worked really well. People start to understand where you're coming from. And in fact, on that site initially, we had a meet the cows day before we introduced anything there. We just had a couple of cows grazing, quiet ones, and got people to come up and have a chat about it. And so that sort of gets the atmosphere out in the open, so you can sort of try and address any issues. And then we put the cattle on, and there were some complaints, but it was fine. And then I took them away last year for TB testing, and we got stopped by the police on the way home for stealing the cattle from the reserve because the dog walkers didn't want them gone. We had to prove they were our cattle before we could bring them home. So it can be done. Signage is good, but it's got to be sort of sensible signage instead of "don't do this." It's got to be the reason we'd like you not to do this is because, and yeah, plenty of engagement really.
Fantastic, great answer, thank you. Do you need to remove the dung that's produced over the winter from the area where you want to have a meadow? One for you maybe, Emma?
Well, no, I would say this depends, but generally, I mean, dung is part of the nutrient cycle. It's important for the soil biology. So, you know, you've got to look after your below ground biodiversity as well as your above ground. And, you know, so herbivore dung is incredibly important. You might want to, if it's ponies, you might want a harrow, which will spread the dung across the field so you don't get any come up in the hay if you're making hay. But also it would depend on your nutrient levels. So if you know, you want relatively low nutrients in your soil in order to have a maximum species diversity in your meadow. But I would say your winter grazing, you're grazing the aftermath, which grows back. I would say you probably don't need to, but you may need a harrow. Like maybe Hillary has something to follow that with.
No, I agree with that. I think as long as your stocking rate is adjusted to be low enough, you haven't got 100 dairy cows in there, then you should be fine. You know, if you've got sensible winter stocking, then yeah, harrow out your pony latrine and you'll be fine.
I mean, I guess it's important to note that historically, I mean, meadows are, you know, an artificial habitat almost, and you know, sort of created by human management, and they would have maintained a nutrient level by applying farmyard manure and aftermath grazing. So there is an argument for that there's a place for manure in the process of managing a meadow.
Fabulous, thank you both. We've covered this already, and I think it's a question about ragwort. We've talked about it being dangerous for horses and ponies. I assume it's not dangerous then for sheep or cattle.
It's just as dangerous to sheep and cattle.
Oh, right, okay.
But sheep have a shorter lifespan, so you can actually sort of use sheep to eat out the young ragwort rosettes in the spring, the sort of late spring, and by the time it kills them, they're dead anyway, sort of thing. Okay. So it's they, like ponies, they won't eat it when it's actively growing, but if it gets accidentally cut and included in hay, then it can be damaging.
Okay, thank you. I think we are up to date on questions. So if anybody else in the audience wants to quickly type in a question, if they've got any burning questions they want to ask our panel, then please do. Just having a quick look through. There is a question for Emma about expanding on what the solution is for commercial farmers if they're under pressure to produce a lot in a short time.
It's tricky because it is a real challenge. You know, there's a lot of challenges to agriculture, and this is one of them. Commercial farmers can incorporate sort of they call it rougher grazing into their farm business by if they've got a suckler herd, so they've got, you know, breeding calves. The cows might be able to do out on rough grazing, so they might be able to utilize it that way, particularly if they use a continental or a quicker growing, heavier bull on those cows. Also, if you start to direct sell, it may not matter so much if you're the product you're selling direct to the public, and they're buying a high quality, high nutritional value product that they can believe in. That's another route to that more commercial farmers might take, or the fact that if you can make it work, you'll reduce your inputs, possibly be able to avoid winter housing, which is where most of your costs are incurred. And you may be, if you're very savvy and in the right place, you might be able to make that work. Perhaps someone else has got some opinions on that.
Well, in the Nature Friendly Farming Network, we're talking a lot at the moment about less is more approach, and what research has been proving is that up until the point where your grass growth is supporting your livestock, and then you go over a point where you've got more livestock than that grass growth can support, then the amount that it costs you to produce every extra kilo of produce goes up. So you sort of achieve your maximum sustainable output on the available grass, and then after that your variable cost line rises much quicker. So there's a sort of a sweet spot where your fixed costs are level and your variable costs are just in a straight line, and then your profit is between those two lines. And then as the variable costs start to increase, then your profit reduces. So what may well be going to happen, particularly with new farm support payments, is that people do have to reduce their stocking levels and produce to the maximum sustainable output that nature's given them in their grasslands.
Am I right in thinking you had a slide on that, Hilary, in the last session?
I did, yes.
Yeah, so I think
it's a bit topical at the moment.
I think Lucia has posted a link to the video for the last session, so if anyone wants to look into that a bit more, that would be there.
And just look up Chris Clark and less is more.
There we go, thank you. And it looks like we've got one last question coming in. I think that will be the last one then. Owen, how do you manage the number of ponies in your herd? Do you sell them? And if you do, and if so, do you back them for riding before selling them? Also, do you have any issues with public access, given that you have a stallion as part of the herd?
Okay, I'll start off with the second part of the question then. So with the stallion, this applies to all my ponies. They've all got good temperaments, so they're all very good with people. So with the Section A's, the aim is to breed them for ridden purposes. So if you think about Section A, it's going to be young children riding them. So temperament is key then. So the stallions I've got are actually very quiet. They're very easy to catch, but at the same time, they're not boisterous. They don't bite, they don't kick or anything. They're very, very quiet. As it happens, the stallion I've got is in a field where there isn't a public footpath. I guess that's not intentional, but it just happens to be the case. Even if people did walk through the field, he'd be perfectly fine with them. So with this stallion, he's got brothers and sisters who have gone to the very top as ridden ponies. They've competed in Horse of the Year show with young children on them. So if you can put a young child on them, it kind of shows that their temperament is fine. In terms of breeding then, I breed some foals every year. Some are to replace older stock, I guess, just to keep the lines going. Some of them are then sold on. So all the ponies I've got, I breed them for a purpose. So the purpose for me is for ridden. So I've got to make sure that they've got good temperaments, good length of rein, conformationally that they're sound. So they're not just conservation grazing ponies. These are ponies bred for a purpose as well. So hopefully that answers your question.
That's brilliant, Owen. Thank you so much. And I think it's probably time to start wrapping up now. Thank you so much to all the speakers, to the panelists, to Jan and Lucia, who are behind the scenes answering the chats as we were going through. It's been such a fascinating session. I've learned so much from it. It's been brilliant. And if you've missed any bits or want to kind of recap on anything, don't worry, because we'll have a recording which will be sent around via video, via email after tonight's session. We'll make sure we've got the links to all the websites and bits covered in that too. Yeah, if you have any more specific questions for any of the panelists, do email us and we can try and get you in touch. And I think that's it from me. Have a fabulous evening. Don't forget to sign up for the third of the sessions. I think again, Lucia's probably put a link into the chat field there. Otherwise, we'll be in touch to let you know when that is. So once again, thank you to everybody for attending, and thank you to our panelists.